Okay, in this chapter, we were going to focus on fiscal policy. We will focus on getting a better understanding of how governments, as well as the Treasury, go around taxation, how they go about spending, how they go about borrowing, really understand the difference between a government's revenue and expenditure. Okay, breaking down all these different elements will help us build a better understanding on which way we feel an economy could go based on these policy decisions and which way we feel we could structure investment portfolios. Okay, remember when speaking to investors, whether they're active investors or prospects, you want to fill them with as much knowledge and information as possible. So by you having an understanding on the government's fiscal policies, understand where they got money coming in, where they got money going out, will help build a client a better picture of where they see the economy going in the near to long term. And that being said, that will allow you to structure portfolios or build portfolios that bit better. Right now, we're going to be focusing on fiscal policies. Now, fiscal policy is a term used globally, but for our seminar here and for our slides, it's going to be predominantly UK focused. Okay, so the term fiscal policy really comes from the Latin word fiscus, which is referred to the Roman emperor's treasury. Okay, so it's originally fiscus originally means basket, so it's used to collect taxes. Okay, so that's what it was defined, many years ago. Now, over time, it has evolved to signify government revenue and expenditures. So when we talk about modern economics, it refers to the government's uses of taxation and spending in order to influence the overall economy. So it is a critical tool for managing economic growth, inflation, unemployment, and all done by adjusting, public finances and making sure resource allocation is efficient. Now, in the UK, Her Majesty's Treasury is responsible for overseeing public finances, okay, as well as managing economic policy and ensuring sustainable public spending. So, you will hear, especially when it comes to the budget and so forth, you will hear phrases like the Treasury or the Chancellor of the Exchequer. So, it's important to really get familiar because the Treasury works under the authority of the government and advises on fiscal policies, tax decisions, as well as public debt management. Now, here in the UK, as mentioned, the Treasury is led by the Chancellor of the Exchequer. He is responsible for overseeing the department's functions. But there are a team of ministers that have a massive impact. You will have a chief secretary to the Treasury. You will have financial secretaries to the Treasury, economic secretaries, and exchequer secretaries as well. So, these officials, along with other senior civil servants, ensure that the Treasury, policies and their financial policies are implemented. Now, one thing I want to just touch on is some of the key decision makers when it comes to fiscal policy and the implementation of it. One, we've discussed the Chancellor of the Exchequer. He or she has the primary authority and is responsible for the country's fiscal policy. Then behind that, you will have the Prime Minister. Okay, he or she provides the overall strategic goal and direction that they're looking to achieve. Then you've got the Treasury ministers that we've discussed, and then finally you'll have Parliament. Okay, Parliament approves budgets as well as key financial measures which have been proposed. So that tends to be the order of authority. So it's something worth keeping an eye on, as governments focus very heavily on making sure they got the right thought of budgets in place, and the Treasury and the Chancellor always tends to speak out on a regular basis. Now, moving on to the key components of fiscal policies. It is predominantly comprised of two areas, which is government spending as well as taxation. And as much as we'll delve into detail throughout the coming slides, it's important to also recognize other areas of fiscal policy which are important. So when we talk about government spending, look, I think it's within the name, everyone's going to be very familiar with this area. It just refers to the expenditure by the government on goods and service to influence the overall economy. You will have capital expenditure and revenue expenditure. So when we talk about capital expenditure, this is spending on long-term investments such as major infrastructure, roads, bridges, schools, which is designed to enhance future economic productivity. Then you'll have the revenue expenditure. This is the day-to-day operational spending by the government on salaries, subsidies, defense, health, education, welfare, such as benefits. So by increasing spending, the government can stimulate demand in the economy and promote growth, especially during a recession. And on the flip side of that, cutting spending can help control inflation during periods of high demand. But again, it could also lead us into difficult times. So a lot of this will go hand in hand. When it comes to taxation, this naturally involves collecting money from individuals and businesses in order to fund all these government activities. And taxation is predominantly defined in two categories: direct taxes and indirect taxes. Direct taxes are the likes of income um, that you and I will be taxed on, corporation tax, property taxes, and so forth. And then you will naturally get indirect taxes. This is on goods and services. We'll be delving into a lot more detail on that. As well as the fact of controlling spending and taxation, it's important to understand you can find yourself in a fiscal deficit or a surplus. When we talk about a deficit, this is when the government's spending exceeds revenue, okay, leading to higher borrowing. Okay, so if the government's spending more than it's actually collecting in taxes, they're going to have to bridge that gap somehow, and that usually comes by the way of borrowing government bonds and so forth, which we will touch on. When it comes to a surplus, this is when revenue exceeds spending. Okay, this is allowing for debt repayment or saving for future infrastructure projects. Okay, which is the best place to be in. You know for a fact you've got more money coming in than you're having to spend, but that can also lead to an issue. Okay, if you're collecting all this money and not spending enough, the people within the country will say, well, hold on, we need hospitals, we need more schools. Why are you not spending enough money in order to continue the growth? So those are areas that is important when it comes to looking at looking at fiscal policies. Next will be public debt management. Managing the level and the structure of government debt is important. This includes, deciding on the mix between short-term and long-term debt, whether it's domestic or foreign borrowing, and strategies to ensure that the debt level remains sustainable rather than having to print more money and getting us in a deeper hole than we need to be. It's not on here, but we will be discussing this in more detail in the coming slides. But when we talk about borrowing, this is, as I touched on a little earlier, it's regards to if we're in a deficit. It's more like deficit financing. So governments often borrow money to cover any deficits that it has, especially when the spending exceeds any form of revenue. Okay, like I mentioned, the government's not getting enough money or not collecting enough taxes. So you can either have domestic borrowing, where you're borrowing in essence from the country's own residents. This is naturally done by issuing government bonds. Then you've got external borrowing. This is borrowing from foreign entities or international financial institutions. So there's multiple ways around it, and it's something we will touch upon. But in essence, those tend to be some of the key components when we are discussing fiscal policies. Finally, we're just going to have a quick look at what are the objectives of fiscal policy. Okay, what is the aim at the end of the day? One will naturally always be economic stability and growth. The policy aims to reduce fluctuations in the economy, okay, by counteracting any form of inflation or recession situations that could come about. So a lot of that is done by adjusting taxes as well as monitoring spending and so forth. When it comes to the growth element, promoting long-term growth is always the aim, not only from here in the UK but from globally. So by investing in infrastructure, education, healthcare, you can help boost a lot of productivity as well as encourage sustainable growth. One would always be the case where we are looking for full employment. That's probably one of the more favored objectives, and that is job creation. More people in work means the government's collecting more taxes, more money for the government to spend on housing, schooling, and so forth. As well as more people being employed, they will have more disposable income. More disposable income being spread into businesses will help businesses grow, and then the businesses will end up paying more taxes, which means the government gets even more money from businesses. So that tends to be the idea of job creation. And having some form of price stability, controlling inflation or deflation is a goal by the government, not just of the central bank. So naturally adjusting spending and taxes to reduce the risk of price volatility is a big factor. Yes, inflation does erode our purchasing power. So having inflation at our core 2% level will be ideal. So in essence, that's the basics at the moment of fiscal policy, predominantly here in the UK. How is it structured? What are the main components of the policy? How we're going to go about spending, as well as collecting taxes, and what are the overall objectives. So again, if there's areas you're struggling with, just go over it one more time. I feel we've covered everything, but again, the coming slides will add further layers onto our learning process. Right, now we're going to be focusing on government spending, as it is a major focus in fiscal policy because it does directly influence economic activity, growth, as well as social welfare. So through spending, governments can stimulate demand, they can create jobs and invest in critical sectors like healthcare, education, as well as the overall infrastructure. Okay, so fiscal policy does help stabilize the economy, especially during a downturn. Okay, it helps to support long-term growth. Furthermore, managing public spending is essential to balance any deficits that we may be in, and the UK are in a financial deficit or a fiscal deficit. It can be designed to reduce debt and ensure fiscal sustainability in the long haul. Okay, so just see it as a primary tool for shaping economic outcomes and achieving, the short to medium and long-term policy goals. Okay, now we'll just focus on the key areas of spending. Okay, when we talk about capital expenditure, this involves spending on long-term assets that can contribute to future economic growth. So when we talk about infrastructure projects, that includes roads, bridges, and airports. Okay, it may not affect us today because a lot of these projects will take years to develop. Just look at HS2. But in the long haul, it will make a transport a lot easier. It will allow us to get to areas in the north a lot easier. And again, if they are to have policies to create new bus routes, new roads, it may open up more job opportunities. Investment into public utilities, that can be into the likes of water, the water facilities, it could be into the electricity grid. Year after year, modernization needs to occur, as well as maybe just maintenance. Okay, construction of hospitals, schools, and other facilities. Now there's a huge demand for more hospitals, more schools. Now again, a hospital will not be put up overnight. But again, you can imagine in the long term, if more hospitals are created, it means waiting lists may potentially come down in a lot of the areas we have at the moment. So it'll be less demand, less burden on current workforce, and it could, help in the long term. It could also involve purchasing equipment or assets for government operations. That's in essence what we would class as capital expenditure. Now, when we talk about revenue expenditure, this in essence is the day-to-day spending for the government to function. Okay, and that could mean salaries and wages to government employees. That could mean any other operational costs for government offices. We will discuss subsidies in a little bit more detail, but that involves food, fuel. It can be in education. Again, defense spending, maintenance of the military. We'll look into that, as well as welfare programs. That could be, benefits. It could be healthcare or so forth. So that is naturally what revenue expenditure would be. When it comes to transfer payments, these are payments made by the government where no goods or services are received in return. Okay, so we're spending money and we're not expecting anything back. So that can be unemployment benefits. It can be if you're retired and you're a pensioner, you're receiving your pension. It could be social welfare schemes where you're a low-income individual or a low-income household. Other places around the globe will offer scholarships and grants, I'm sure. So the next one will be subsidies. Okay, now when we talk about subsidies, they are in essence a financial assistance provided by the government to reduce the cost of goods and services for consumers and producers. Okay, so they're lowering the cost, for example, in agriculture in order to support farmers, making it easier for them to sell. Energy subsidies, to keep fuel and electricity affordable. Okay, here we had the energy crisis over the last number of years due to inflation. Energy costs went on not only due to overall inflation, but also war in Ukraine and Russia has spiked a lot of oil and gas prices. So the government used to give out as £300, for example, for pensioners or anyone that's on low income in order to help pay for their bills. Okay, you can have healthcare subsidies as well to lower the cost of medical care, especially if, for example, you want to go and get your teeth inspected or have some work done in your mouth. You can go to certain surgeries that will allow to be put on the NHS list where you can actually get a lot of work done for a fraction of the cost as well. Governments will also have to pay interest as well as payments on debt. So, payments made by the government to service its debt, can be domestic debt, it can be foreign debt. So those can be interest payments on government bonds. If you're not aware of government bonds, please go onto the section. We do have the section on government bonds. It could also be payments on loans from international institutions that borrowed us money. Defense spending. I think everyone knows within the name, this is expenditure on maintaining and expanding the military and the overall national defense infrastructure. Okay, so that could be the case of procuring new military equipment, whether that's weapons, vehicles, is salaries for all the military personnel. Money should be spent or is being spent on R&D, research and development for defense technology. So these are areas where the government spends quite rapidly and quite actively on in order to keep up with global tensions as well as global spending. If you feel there's a threat and they're spending huge amount on their infrastructure, defense infrastructure, it could leave yourself vulnerable. Okay, so this always tends to be a big talking point, especially during elections or during any government. How much are you spending each year on military and so forth? Some people prefer not to spend a huge amount on the military. Some people choose to spend a lot more, but it can be quite a contentious topic. Finally, grants and aid, financial assistance provided. It can be domestically or internationally, so the government can choose to pump money back into its own people, offer aid here, or it can be offering international aid. International aid always tends to revolve around developing countries. Okay, making sure that the government is helping them out year after year. Again, a very contentious area of spending. There could be grants for local councils or regions, or for example, if there's some form of catastrophe globally, any form of disaster, the governments always tend to offer not only their assistance but also a financial means as well. So that in a nutshell tends to be the overall span of what the government spends its money on. So I feel we've covered everything in this section. Okay, now we're going to take a look into taxation, as it is a key tool for fiscal policy. It refers to the government's ability to collect revenue from you and I, individuals, businesses, as well as other entities out there. We also use the policy to understand how the government is using these funds. How is it influencing the economy? So through taxation, the government can manage demand and control inflation, as well as influence growth. Okay, so we'll look into that a little bit more detail now, how taxation is used as a fiscal policy. Okay, the key one is how they look to expand and contract the economy. So let's talk about stimulating economic growth. It's seen as an expansionary policy. So in times of uncertainty or real big slowdowns or recession, the governments may reduce taxes to increase disposable incomes for individuals and households, um, as well as for the profits of corporations and businesses. This boosts overall consumer spending as well as business investment, which can help the economy recover. Okay, so let's just break that down. You know, in order for the government to want to stimulate the economy, they're going to require you and I to go out and start spending. Okay, and so what they can do is they can say, look, we're going to reduce the taxes that you pay every month. By doing so, we're paying less taxes, we have more disposable income, more money in our pocket. With that more money in our pocket, we may tend to go out and spend a lot more. So we may go and, buy new clothes, do more shopping, buy new cars, buy houses. Where they're out spending that money, okay, which would ordinarily have been taxed. Okay, so we're out there spending it. And by us spending it, the businesses that are benefiting from this extra income from us, they then start to grow. And at the end of the year, they don't have to pay a huge amount of taxes. Okay, and by them not having to pay a huge amount of taxes, they can now think about growing. How can we grow? It could mean more units, maybe more shops being opened. It could be more staff being hired, and in turn, if more staff are hired, those individuals will then start paying taxes, and the government start collecting more taxes overall. Okay, so that's literally the bottom to top effect of expansionary policy. And now the flip side of that naturally will be contractionary policies, really to control inflation. If expansionary involved lowering taxes, I'm sure you know where we're going with this. So if the economy is overheating, such as it's growing too fast or it's leading to inflation, remember inflation tends to mean a huge demand for goods with less supply to a certain degree, so prices go up. Okay, and that's just a basic understanding of it. There are many different factors and layers to inflation, but for this example, the government may look to raise taxes. Why would the government raise taxes? It's designed to reduce disposable income and demands for goods and services. It helps cool down the economy and control inflation. Okay, so now every month we're having to spend more money, or not spend, we're being taxed more money every month. So by that being said, we now have less disposable income. We are now second guessing whether we should be going to restaurants, buying new clothes, buying a new car, or just staying in overall. By us doing that, we are putting less money into the economy and businesses. We're slowing down growth. Okay, businesses then start to suffer or start to stagnate. Okay, and naturally, if there's a low demand for goods and there's a huge supply, the prices tend to come down, inflation tends to drop as well. Okay, so that's the two common ways of expansionary as well as contractionary use of taxation. Now, when we talk about revenue generation, we know taxation is the main source of income for the government. Okay, as much as we may not all like paying taxes, it's in part and parcel of being on this planet. Okay, so the funds collected from taxes are used for healthcare, education, defense, infrastructure, benefits. Okay, so a lot of the time these taxes are structured, normally layered, just like with income tax. You'll always have your basic rate, you'll have your higher rate, and then if you are earning over a set amount, you are paying additional tax as well. And finally, taxes can be used to encourage or discourage certain behaviors. Okay, for example, you may not have to pay taxes on green energy products or research and development businesses. those are tax incentives. If you want to start investing in these sort of areas, there won't be no taxes involved. But if there are goods such as alcohol and cigarettes, there's a huge amount of tax levied on that. Okay, if they're trying to say, look, you're paying a lot of money for these cigarettes, do you really want them? So it could potentially discourage you. Okay, and then in turn you stop. But on the flip side of the government makes a huge amount of money from alcohol, cigarettes, and everything that is harmful to us. The government still benefits from that. Okay, so be fully aware. Now, there are two types of taxes. You've got direct taxes and indirect taxes. We will discuss them, but we're not going to go into a huge amount of detail, as I don't feel it's going to be that beneficial to you, really understanding taxation and the real benefits from it. But when we talk about direct taxes, these are taxes paid directly to the government by individuals or businesses. Okay, these taxes are based on the ability to it's a progressive form of tax. As mentioned earlier, it can be layered. So income tax, for example, higher earners will naturally pay more tax than basic rate taxpayers. Okay, corporation tax, and then there's wealth tax, there's property taxes. So when we talk about direct taxes, always remember these are taxes that are collected by the government, usually paid by individuals, you and I, as well as corporations. Then you've got indirect taxes. These are taxes that are levied on goods and services rather than income or profits. Okay, so this tend to be a VAT. It can be excise duties, which are, as mentioned earlier, specific for tobacco, alcohol, and fuel. You'll have custom duties, which is designed to tax imports and can affect your exports. And then you've got service taxes. All right, so those are your two forms of taxes. But what I want you to do is, as much as just understanding how taxation works, understand how it works in the real world. Now, here in the UK, we've had a general election, not no more than 3 months back, and a lot of the talking points is around how does the government get its money. Okay, and they always say that they're in a deficit, so they need more money. So the way they collect more money is either by spending less and saving more, or it's based on them taxing individuals and businesses. All right, and a lot of those conversations will affect the way that the economy reacts. Okay, if taxes are going up, spending's coming down, it's going to put a strain on the overall economy. And by that happening, we could see that ripple effect head into the financial markets. And then you may start to see less appetite for investors wanting to buy stocks, and they start taking their money out of the markets could come down. So it's important to structure clients and investment portfolios where you believe not only where the economy is going and how that will transcend onto the overall stock market. Okay, now what I've done here is I've put down a rates and threshold for individuals that pay tax between 24 and 25. Now, if you are based outside of the UK, I do appreciate this won't have a huge amount of relevance to you, but it's great just to have that bit of knowledge if you so require. Now, what I've done is just really broken down each individual band, what we're really going to be paying and so forth. I will come on to examples in the next slide and two. Now, when it comes to taxes, there are 3 bands. You've got a basic rate, higher rate, as well as an additional rate. It is a staggered approach. Basic rate, individuals pay 20% tax, higher rate 40%, additional rate 45%. It is all based on earnings, obviously. Now, what we have is a personal allowance of 12,570. So if you earn up to 100k, you're entitled to the full personal allowance. Anything outside and upwards of 12,500, it will start to erode to the stage where you won't get any personal allowance, and that's when you reach 125,140 pounds. So when we talk about personal allowance, you don't have to pay tax on this amount. So if you only earn 12,570 pounds, you do not have to pay tax within that. Okay, not 5%, not 10%, nothing. But every pound you earn outside of that, that's when the taxation begins. So if you're a basic rate taxpayer, for example, and you earn 37,700 a year, you would have to minus 12,570, and so you'll only be taxed on £25,130. Okay, and of that £25,130, you will be paying 20% tax. And then if you earn over 37,000, you then fall into the higher rate band. So the next so every pound outside of 37,700, you will now start to be taxed of 40%. Okay, remember, it's not your whole income which will be 40%, it's staggered. Okay, so if anything you earn up to 37,000 will be 20%. If you earn anything from 37,000 up to 125, all of that will be at 40%. And if you're an additional rate taxpayer, anything over 125,140 will now start to accumulate 45% tax. The examples in the next slide will obviously illustrate it more. And then you also have to pay national insurance contributions. Okay. Although all this information has been dragged off gov.uk, so if you want to know a little bit more about the statistics behind employment, understand further rates, please go onto the website, as it will provide a lot more information. Now, when it comes to national insurance contributions, this will naturally help you in the long haul. When you are ideally a pensioner, you will then start to get money every month. Now, the figures I found were all weekly. So if you earn anything up to £242 a week, you will not be having to pay any national insurance contributions. But anything outside of £242 to £967 for that week, you would pay 8%. Okay, and anything over £967 a week, you will start to get charged 2%. Okay, so when we talk about national insurance, that's what you will get when you're a pensioner. And when we talk about all the bands, that's what the government will take and in turn use those finances to invest in infrastructure, housing, healthcare, and so forth. Okay, now what I've got here is a breakdown of a basic rate taxpayer who earns £35,000 a year. Okay, what I wanted to show you was just the difference in changing the tax policies from 20% to 18% and what sort of difference that could possibly have. Okay, so let's just run through the example we've got here at the moment. So we've got on the left hand side an individual that earns £35,000 a year. He is entitled to his personal allowance of £12,570. So that means for the year his overall taxable income will be £22,430. Okay, remember, 12,570 is not taxed. He will only be taxed on just over £22,000. He will pay, or she will pay, a 20% rate. So over the course of the year, £4,484 will be given away as income tax. Okay, there will be a national insurance contribution for when you retire of £1,794. So your take home will be £28,721. Okay, that is how much you will be taken home for you to spend and do whatever you want. Now on the flip side of that, everything remains the same, but look at the part where it says income tax at 18%. If the government were to reduce income tax for a basic rate taxpayer from 20% to 18%, that would be a saving of £447 a year. Okay, so that's quite a lot. And let's use a hypothetical example, because here in the UK, the government, or Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, collected just shy of £900 billion in taxes, that is income taxes, for 2023 to 2024. Okay, that was a year-on-year increase of 5%. Okay, so they collect, let's just say, less than £1 trillion. Okay, they're projected to be about 36 million taxpayers in the UK. Roughly 28 million are basic, 6 million are higher rate, and 1 million are additional. Okay, and let's say, for example, just for argument's sake, because it will be very difficult to see what the all and out all figure would be. Let's say, for example, if all basic rate taxpayers were earning 35,000 a year. Okay, let's say there's 26 million of them, and if the government then increased or if they decreased it like we've done in this example, the government would lose out on roughly 12.5 billion a year. Okay, that's if they were to reduce it. So that could be a big burden on a country which especially is in a deficit, is just compounding their misery, right? But if, for example, the government were to increase taxes from 20 to 22%, okay, it would roughly make an extra £450 a year. So roughly the same, right? But in their pockets now, okay. By that being said, the government then in turn would raise just shy of 13 billion. Okay, this is all, of course, it's not always going to be the same because everyone earns different. You can earn 22, 25, 30 grand, £30,000 a year. But I'm just saying, hypothetically, if everyone was earning 35,000 a year and you were a basic rate taxpayer, the government would have generated an additional just shy of 13 billion a year. Okay, so that's just a very quick example of how well a government can use its resources, which are you and I, to generate the money it requires. We don't want to pay that additional form of tax. It does take money out. We don't have as much disposable income, but the governments naturally would justify it by saying that they would spend it on schooling or new hospitals, or it could be just paying off debt overall. Okay, so it may not benefit us in the near term, but could benefit us in the long term. But again, if, for example, they did reduce the taxes to 18% here, we've got an extra, £447 a year. We can go and do what we want with that £447. So we'll enjoy it for the near term, but in the long term, it may have or in the near term, it will impact the Treasury massively. But in the long haul, income tax rates may go back up. Okay, so just a very quick example of a hypothetical solution, but again, it's a policy which is actively used. Okay, now what I've done here is I've just, put up a little example of an individual that earns over 125,150. So let's say, for example, this individual earns 126,000 a year. Okay, he will not be entitled, or she will not be entitled to personal allowance. Okay, which means that the basic rate tax will be still 20%, but they will be taxed on the full 37,700. And in turn, in that bracket alone, this individual pays, over 7 grand. And then as it staggers on, it goes on. So at the end of the year, the individual will pay in the region of just over £42,900 in income tax. Okay, and at the end of the year, his take home or her take home will be 78,566. Okay, so it's important to really understand. The more you earn, naturally, the more you will be taxed. Okay, so yeah, just to let those examples sink in. Remember, if the government wants to increase additional rate tax from 45 to 50%, that could mean a lot, or even increasing every band by 2%, that would have a considerable impact on how much more money the government can start collecting and in turn spending and so forth. Okay, now we're going to be focusing on what fiscal deficits and what is a fiscal surplus. These are key terms used in finance. They're used to describe the balance or the difference between a government's total expenditure and its total revenues, excluding borrowing. Okay, so this is the difference between what the government spends on public services, infrastructure, social projects, and what it earns via taxes, fees, and other non-debt sources of income within a fiscal year. Now, a fiscal deficit really happens when the government spends more than it earns. Okay, so remember, when we talk deficit, this happens when a government is spending more money than it's got coming back in. Okay, this can be caused by a number of factors. increased spending on public services. It could be lower taxes being collected. It could be external shocks. It can be higher interest payments on debt it currently has. So when a fiscal deficit occurs, the government intends to or has to really borrow more money to cover that gap. This can lead to growing national debt and other economic consequences if it's not managed effectively. But let's just go into a bit more detail on how a deficit actually happens. The first point to make is increased government spending. Okay, more money is going out. The government may need to spend more money in areas such as public services, healthcare, education, defense. Okay, it could be social programs. Governments may want to expand, you know, their range and their level of unemployment benefits. You know, give greater pensions to individuals that are retired. It could be subsidies. Okay, especially during times of hardship and economic distress. You know, the government tends to spend more in order to build confidence and rejuvenate the markets to a certain degree. Another one would be lower revenue collections. This, in essence, is if economic activity slows down, people and businesses earn less, leading to maybe lower income tax, corporate tax, sales tax. And when I say leads to lower tax, I mean the government is not collecting as much taxes as it once done. In a robust, rallying economy, you know, businesses are expanding, they're employing more people, so more taxes are being generated and in turn collected by the governments. Now, if that is to change, the governments are taking less, okay, and in turn doesn't have as much money as it once did, let's say, a year or so ago. It could be down to tax cuts. You know, governments may reduce taxes to stimulate economic activity, okay, or to win political favor. You know, these are two ways in which tax cuts could work in a government's best interest. But as well as having that benefit of growth, it does reduce the government's revenue in the short term. So there is somewhat of a payoff. There could be external shocks, you know, economic recessions. You know, recessions, you know, governments may experience both, you know, falling revenues and increased spending. Okay, so you got less money coming in, but you're forced to spend enough money to get the economy kick-started. Okay, and so you won't have that balance. You'll be in a deficit for a longer period of time. It could be a national disaster. We could have, you know, God forbid, another pandemic. And I think everyone's lived through it who's listening to this. And you would have noticed whether you're in the UK or abroad, the governments, you know, go over and above. They're spending more money within the healthcare sector. They're spending more money on furlough in order to, you know, grow a slowing economy. But in the short term, it does reduce it. And now we will experience in the medium to long term, taxes naturally have to go up. They're going to have to fill that hole one way or another. Okay, it could be policy decisions. You know, governments might deliberately run fiscal deficits as part of its strategy to boost economic growth. You know, governments are very well aware if they are increasing spending and they're cutting taxes, you know, they're there to drive their economy further. But they are also well aware they are collecting less money, and as well as the government, as well as the economy expanding, they are collecting less money in their short term. So these are not things that the government's unaware of. They do these things if they need to, and they can make it work in their best interest at times. Now, the key to a fiscal deficit is really understanding how it comes about. And I've got the formula here. We've got total expenditure minus total revenue receipts plus non-debt receipts. So let's just break that down in a little bit more detail. When we talk about total expenditure, this is the total amount of money that the government spends, excluding both revenue, which is revenue, which is salaries, interest payments, as well as capital expenditure. So money spent on infrastructure projects. Okay, the total amount the government will spend. Okay, and then you take that away from the total revenue receipts and non-debt capital receipts. Total revenue receipts, these are taxes, income tax, corporate tax, VAT. It could include duties and other non-tax revenues such as, fines, unfortunately, fees, profits from government owned enterprises. So that's the money coming in. We also talk about non-debt capital receipts. In essence, these are the ways the government raises money by selling assets or getting back money it had previously loaned out, rather than taking on any new debt. Okay, so that's the simple equation of how you can gauge whether a country's economy is in a fiscal deficit or not. Implications of a fiscal deficit. So we know how it comes about, we know how it's formulated, but what are some of the implications? We have touched on a few, but we'll go into a little bit more detail. One would be government government borrowing. Okay, any form of fiscal deficit indicates that the government needs to borrow more money to cover the shortfall. Okay, remember, if you're spending a huge amount and you don't have that same amount coming in, the government will need to borrow money to cover that shortfall, and it can come from domestically or from foreign sources, but traditionally it tends to involve issuing government bonds. Okay, people will tend to buy that. That will refinance the government. It will have a natural impact on national debt. Especially a persistent fiscal deficit. It does increase the government's debt burden. Borrowings accumulate over time, could lead to higher interest payments and potential fiscal strain in the future. Okay, economic stimulus. Look, in the short term, a fiscal deficit can stimulate the economic activity. Remember, increased government spending can boost confidence, boost demand, helps the economy grow, especially during a recession. Remember, it's not just central bank policies that are there to, stimulate economies or cool down economies. The governments go about it with their own way through their fiscal policies. There's always inflation risk. Large fiscal deficit, if financed by purely just printing money, okay, can lead to inflationary pressure, reducing purchasing power over time. So that's one thing to be very conscious and wary of. Finally, we want to discuss how we can actually resolve any form of fiscal deficit. Governments can reduce it either by increasing revenues or cutting expenditure. But traditionally, it's done by a combination of both. The goal really is to narrow the gap between what the government spends and what it earns, eventually bringing spending in line with overall revenue. So when we talk about increased revenue, this just means often adjusting taxes or improving the efficiency of tax collection. The main typical way will be raise tax. Okay, so governments may raise individual tax rates. It could be corporation tax rates. It could be sales tax, VAT. That will in turn increase the government's revenue by increasing the tax burden on us. They will be collecting a lot more. They can broaden the tax base, reducing exemptions, loopholes, just making it a lot tighter and harder for you to hide money. Okay, there could be new taxes introduced. Governments may create carbon taxes, any other form of taxes if they feel that there's an area we can do a cash grab. More often than not, they tend to do it. Another one would be obviously to improve tax collection. I think they're pretty strict on this already. They will reduce the likes of tax evasion, strengthen tax enforcement, just really putting pressure on individuals to, pay up, give money what they feel is due to them. One could be reducing government spending. Governments can cut their expenditure to reduce the deficit. This is somewhat of a touchy issue. It will be a very political sensitive issue, not only socially, but could have economic consequences as well. Okay, so yeah, so when we talk about cutting public spending, It could mean cut back on subsidies for energy, food, and agriculture. Remember, we've got, an energy crisis. Governments used to help out with pensioners, people that are struggling, used to give them some form of relief. They can say, you know what, we're not going to do that no more. Okay, so they could also put a wage freeze on the public sector. Um, Even though here in the UK we've given junior doctors a huge amount of money, an extra pay rise. But the governments can be a lot more strict. They can reduce wages. They can put hiring freezes out there, and so stop any form of expenditure. They can target welfare programs, social spending. Um, you know, Governments can cut spending or eliminate critical services. Okay, it could be based on age, pension, circumstance. So these are the ways. If the government really wants to cut back, they can put their squeeze on individuals that are pensioners or in a difficult situation overall. The next one will be structural reforms. Now, everything's not a case of taxing as high as you possibly can, or cutting spending everywhere you possibly can. Long-term structural reform can reduce fiscal deficits as well by promoting sustainable economic growth and improving efficiency of government finances. So one could be encourage investments, such as infrastructure development, improve the business climate, encourage private investments. This can expand the economy, leading to higher tax revenues in the long haul without having to rise taxes right now. They could find ways to promote employment, different measures in order to stimulate job creation. It could be, better job training, tax incentives for hiring, or even subsidies. Even bigger work on apprenticeships. So without having to do anything drastic, this can increase income tax revenue, in the long haul. So that's that. And the final one would be control borrowing. Governments will naturally want to reduce their reliance on borrowing to cover any form of fiscal debt. Easier said than done, unfortunately. Government tends to print money as and when they want. But they can maybe borrow more efficiently, negotiate lower interest rates on existing debt that they have, issuing new bonds that have more favorable terms to, reduce any form of debt servicing costs. Maybe restructuring their debt. Governments can restructure their debt, extending the repayment term, negotiate lower rates, reduce that could reduce any form of immediate fiscal pressure. One which tends to be very common is, adjusting the debt ceiling. So debt ceilings exist. The government, in essence, is a limit how much the government can offer, can borrow. So it forces policymakers to reduce the tax deficit by adjusting spending and revenue and so forth. So these are the different ways in which governments can go about reducing a tax deficit. So really take this on board, because this is out there in the public domain. It affects your day-to-day life. Always understand what prime ministers and presidents, if you're watching this from different countries, how they go about stimulating the economy. You will notice certain things which are unfavorable, and it's all in relation to how they're going to plug a deficit and move forward from there. Okay, a fiscal surplus occurs when a government's total revenue exceeds its total expenditure in a given fiscal year. So in other words, the government is earning more than it is spending, creating an excess of funds. Now, you've heard us use the phrase fiscal year quite a few times. Fiscal year, in essence, is just a 12-month accounting period for a lot of self-employed individuals, for corporations to a certain degree, or certain entities. It is between the 6th of April to the 5th of April. So that could be the 6th of April 2024 to the 5th of April 2025. With the government, they've got their own accounting period that is between the 1st of April, okay, to the 31st of March. Some accounting periods are the full year from January to December. Okay, so it's important to understand. But when it comes to the government, to my knowledge, it's the 1st of April to the 31st of March. Okay, now let's have a look at the equation that we use for fiscal surplus. That is total revenue take away total expenditure. So let's just refresh our minds once again. When we talk about total revenue, this is income for the government. This includes taxes, okay, income tax, corporation tax, VAT, non-tax revenues as well, so fees, fines, dividends that the government gets from state-owned enterprises, earnings from public services, royalties as well. Other income could be interest on government assets or foreign aid. Okay, whatever money we've lent out, we get interest back on that. And then we would minus that from total expenditure. So this is what the government spends. And that, as we know, is public services. So healthcare, education, police, defense, welfare programs. Retired individuals get pension. There can be unemployment benefits. Infrastructure such as roads, railways, public buildings. So those tend to be the main components for revenue and expenditure. Now we want to look into the causes of a surplus. How does a surplus come about? One is higher revenue. Okay, a surplus may be result from higher than expected tax revenue due to solid economic growth. It could be increased business profits, high level of employment, or just based on better tax collection efforts. So we've done better making sure that taxes are being collected more efficiently. It could be based on reduced expenditure. So if the government spend less than anticipated or delays certain projects, big infrastructure projects, a surplus can result. Okay. It might occur due to just really efficient spending. We're doing better, we're sourcing a lot better our resources. It could be reduced welfare costs because there's high levels of employment, less levels of unemployment. And as mentioned a little earlier, a delay maybe or a halt in certain infrastructure projects. HS2, for example, HS2 will not extend as far as it was initially designed to do, so that will save the government a little bit of money. The government can choose to maybe go into, opt for austerity measures. So the governments will deliberately run a surplus. So by cutting the spending, raising taxes, or really a combination of both. Yes, in the near term, it's not going to be ideal. It won't be nice, but their aim will be for the long term to have better fiscal stability and better growth maybe in the future. So it's not something that's going to be award-winning and appealing to people right now, but in the long run, fingers crossed, we get the reduction in taxes and so forth and greater spending. How governments use a surplus is essential. Okay, remember, if the government is bringing more money in, less money going out, it has greater flexibility. So it could allow itself to pay down debts. The government can use the surplus to reduce its existing debt, so lowering future interest payments and improving the overall financial health. It could be saving for future spending. The surplus can be saved if there is going to be any form of downturn or emergency in the long term. The government knows and the Treasury knows it's got enough funds there to counteract that. Say, for example, another pandemic, the funds are there in order to do furlough schemes, in order to instigate new maybe, where you can eat out for a lot less, for example, subsidies for big restaurants. The government and the Treasury could use the money to invest in new projects, so infrastructure projects such as healthcare, education, maybe bringing and building new train links up north where it's going to make it easier for the people to commute to other areas, bigger cities where there is more work. Okay, and in the long haul, maybe provide tax cuts. The governments may decide to reduce taxes, which could leave more money in the hands of you and I. individuals as well as businesses, potentially stimulating consumer spending and investment. So if the government knows it's got a huge amount of money sitting in the treasury, and they can afford to say, you know what, let's reduce taxes, let individuals and businesses keep more of what they earn, okay, and that will obviously create the confidence. It will spur on growth, especially in the long haul. So those are the main ways surpluses are actually used. So whenever you are, looking and really digesting this information, a lot of it will come from the Chancellor of the Exchequer. A lot of it will also come from the Prime Minister. So always understand how the government money is being spent. Is that addressing short-term needs? Is it addressing the long-term needs? That can then put you in a better position to decide if you want to invest your money in the financial markets because you believe the economy will grow, or look to profit take and maybe hedge overall portfolios. Okay, public debt management is a key component of fiscal policy. It does involve the strategies governments will use in order to manage their debt levels effectively. The goal is always to ensure that the borrowing costs are minimized while the risk is controlled in order to ensure long-term fiscal sustainability. Okay, it does include decisions on the amount of debt, the types of debt instruments such as bonds, and the timing of those issuance. Any form of effective debt management ensures that governments can meet their financial or their financing needs without negatively impacting economic stability. Okay, and it helps really maintain overall investor confidence in not only government securities but also their overall policy. Now, a phrase you probably are not going to hear often unless you are studying for your exams is the public sector net cash requirement, also known as PSNCR. It's not an agency or a body, it's just a financial measure used in the UK to indicate how much the government needs to borrow to finance its budget deficit in a given period of time. So the PSNCR shows the difference between the government's total cash by way of revenues and its total cash expenditures. It's closely monitored by the Treasury as well as the Debt Management Office, the DMO. Okay, and that's something we'll just fire into right now. So when it comes to overall public debt, it is primarily managed by the DMO, the Debt Management Office. They are responsible for issuing government bonds. Okay, so they will first look to see what's the deficit or what's the issue with regards to the public sector net cash requirement. Is there a big deficit? If so, then it's down to the Debt Management Office to issue the relevant gilts. Okay, so they are there to issue government bonds and measure or manage any other government borrowing needs. Okay, so it's just there really to ensure that the public borrowing is carried out efficiently at a low cost and at a manageable risk. So all that being said, it's important to really understand what sort of strategies governments will implement. Okay, one will be issuing bonds, and that will be done via the Debt Management Office. So the government can sell bonds to raise funds, offering investors a return over a specific period of time. Remember, if you are not familiar with bonds or do not know too much about it, please go on to our section with regards to bonds. Okay, but in a nutshell, bonds are traditionally the government issuing a certificate or a letter to say, if you are to give us £1 million, we will give you every year, for example, let's say it's a 10-year bond. Okay, so if you invest and you purchase a government bond for £1 million and it says pays a 5% coupon, every year for those 10 years you will receive 5% on your £1 million invested. Okay, at the end of the 10-year term, once the bond matures, the government will give you your £1 million back. Okay, but by issuing bonds and selling these bonds to the public, the government then will raise all this capital, and with all the capital raised, it can, build new infrastructure, offer, new schooling, help out with the NHS. It's just a way of the government raising finance. Another one is debt restructuring. Adjusting repayment terms with creditors to extend loan periods or maybe lower interest rates is important, or they may want to reduce the principal amount when the debt becomes unsustainable. So a lot of that will be on the negotiating table. Anything you can lower, whether it's paying less interest or bringing the term down and writing off some of the debt, that would be ideal. A debt ceiling is something which is very common, especially in the US. Again, it's just a limit on the amount of debt the government can issue. Okay, so let's say you're only allowed to be in £10 trillion worth of $10 trillion worth of debt. Okay, but if you are required to borrow more funds and you need that debt ceiling to be put higher, it does have to require approval. Okay, but again, then you're just falling further and further into a deficit. Okay, and then the final one would be just refinancing debt. Replacing old debt with new debt at a lower interest rate can potentially reduce costs overall. So a lot of these are the factors and ways in which public debt management strategies are used. So please feel free to look into it, but it's important to understand the role of the public sector net cash requirement, because remember, it does reflect the difference between spending and revenue. And if there is a huge amount of deficit, then it will be in the hands of the DMO, who will be responsible for issuing government bonds and managing the overall bond needs. So it's probably not used in the public domain and on news channels a lot, but that in essence is how it works. Okay, now what we're going to do is just really try summarizing a lot of what we've discussed and really put our investor caps on now. Why should investors keep a track of fiscal policies? Well, the pure and simple reason is, they have a significant impact on economic growth, inflation, interest rates, as well as just overall market conditions. So it's important for us to break down each area and really see how it will affect our decision making, whether we're looking to invest in the markets ourselves. Because remember, the economy and the markets are two completely separate entities. But if we are seeing global growth within global economies, that naturally has a spillover effect on the investment arena, and investors tend to invest a lot more. So, and when we talk about impact on economic growth, you've got fiscal stimulus policies, and then you've got austerity measures. So if we talk about fiscal stimulus, this is an expansionary policy. Governments increase spending or they look to cut taxes. It tends to stimulate demand and boost economic growth. Can lead to higher corporate earnings, benefiting investors overall. Okay, but be aware, if we do excessive amount of spending, cutting a lot of taxes, it could lead to higher inflation, which could lead to an economy overheating, and then what tends to lead to contractionary policies. Okay, it could be austerity measures as well. These policies involve really reducing the spending or increasing taxes, or it could be a combination of both. Imagine the government stops spending and increase taxes. Okay, that would put a lot of hardship on individuals in the short term. It would naturally slow down economic growth, but they do this try controlling their own debt. Okay, it could lead to lower business activity and reduced investment opportunities. But again, if the government gets itself where it's got a surplus of funds, then it may be in a position to say, fine, you know what, let's reduce taxes and let's start spending again and really going for the expansionary policies once again. Another one would be to influence inflation and interest rates. So when we talk about inflation control, fiscal policies that inject too much money into the economy can lead to inflation. It erodes the real return of investors. We then have less purchasing power. Our money doesn't go as far as we want it to go. So investors need to be mindful of how these policies really affect the overall price stability. Interest rate movements. So when it comes to inflation, it can require the central bank to raise interest rates. Remember, when we talk fiscal policy, they've got no say in central bank decisions or anything with interest rates. But if inflation exists, it is often influenced by fiscal policies as well. So it could lead to central banks wanting to raise interest rates to cool down the economy. Higher rates can make borrowing more expensive, not only for you and I, but for businesses, and it will potentially reduce corporate profits and lowering overall stock prices. The next one will be budget deficits and public debt. Now, when it comes to debt levels, a country, running very high budget deficits and accumulating large public debt will or may come across a lot more challenges in financing its obligations. I always use the word credit worthiness. If you've got a huge amount of debt, and you just keep extending the debt ceiling over and over again, your credit rating could at some point become challenged. AAA rated countries could lose a notch. So that's one thing to keep a very close eye on. So when we talk about debt levels, this can raise the cost of borrowing, crowd out a lot of private investors and limit future economic growth. Another way to look at it is debt sustainability. Investors watch for signs that a country's debt might become unsustainable. Okay, so high level of debt can lead to higher interest payments. As we know, it can reduce the government's ability to spend or really be productive and really want to spur growth. So keep a very close eye on how much debt the governments are going into, and you can always keep an eye with the Treasury. It tends to be a telltale sign. And now the final part will be political risks. Frequent changes in fiscal policies due to maybe political instability can create uncertainty for investors, making it really harder to predict market conditions and corporate performances. So especially during times of an election as well, you normally get a manifesto and they normally promise everything. They say we're going to spend, but they never mention the part about where they're going to find that money from. In order to get that sort of money, it's usually from you and I by increasing our taxes. Okay, so they do a lot of these policies and they don't really map out how they're going to pay for it. And when they come into power, what they tend to do is say, we will do everything, or we're not going to do everything that we wanted to do because we have inherited a bad balance sheet, for example. Okay, so they say if we are going to do it, we're going to have to increase taxes, even though it wasn't part of their manifesto. All right, so these are things to be very clear about, because a lot of these decisions are very political and can either work in a party's favor or against them. So hopefully that should bring everything together in a nutshell on why fiscal policies are so important, how it can affect countries, how it affects our debt levels, and how as an investor we can go about it. So if you're unclear, try going over a few things, and a lot of the data as well on this can be found on gov.uk. So if there are areas which maybe I haven't explained as well as I possibly could, visit the website and they will have a lot of the information there as well.